black flight attendant sees a boy on her flight who looks exactly like her dead son. Her heart races as the boy whispers a shocking truth that changes everything. He's watching. Don't trust him. What secrets has her son been hiding? And why is the man sitting next to him so terrifyingly familiar? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The steady patter of rain against the window matched the rhythm of Amara's 34-year-old black flight attendant heartbeat as she stood in her dimly lit apartment. The worn family photo trembled in her hands, its edges softened from years of handling. Under the warm glow of her reading lamp, 3 smiling faces beamed back at her. Her twin boys, Jason Jordan, their gap-toothed grins identical, and Derek, his arm wrapped protectively around their small shoulders. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to save you," she whispered, her voice catching on each word. Her fingers traced the outline of the boys' faces, remembering how their skin felt under her touch, soft and warm and alive. They had been only 3 years old in the photo, taken at Henderson Park during better days, when their family was whole and happiness seemed permanent. A police siren wailed in the distance, its mournful cry piercing through the quiet apartment. The sound transported Amara back 7 years, to that terrible night that had torn her world apart. The memory crashed over her like a wave, drowning her in its bitter waters. It had been a Tuesday evening, unseasonably warm for October. Derek had appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was washing dishes, car keys jingling in his hand. "Taking the boys for a fun drive," he'd announced, that easy smile spreading across his face. "We won't be long." Jason Jordan had bounded past him, already in their matching blue jackets. "Bye, Mama," they'd called out in unison, their excited voices echoing through the house. Amara had dried her hands on a dish towel and knelt to give them each a quick kiss, breathing in their sweet, clean scent. "Be good for Daddy," she'd told them, smoothing Jordan's wild curls. "I love you both so much." If only she'd known those would be her last words to them. If only she'd held them longer, memorized their faces more carefully, asked more questions about where they were going. The what-ifs had haunted her every day since. Hours had passed that night with no word from Derek. Her calls went straight to voicemail. Worry had gnawed at her stomach as she paced the living room, wearing a path in the carpet. Then came the knock that changed everything. 2 police officers had stood on her doorstep, their faces grave in the porch light. "Mrs. Daniels?" the older one had asked, removing his hat. "May we come in?" The words that followed were a blur of horror. Car accident, intense fire, complete destruction, no survivors identified. She remembered screaming, remembered her legs giving out, remembered the younger officer catching her before she hit the floor. But it was the absence of detail that would later plague her thoughts. No specific location, no witnesses, no clear explanation of what had caused the crash. Now, standing in her apartment 7 years later, Amara's tears fell silently onto the photograph's glossy surface. She wiped them away carefully, not wanting to damage the precious image. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the window, a constant companion to her grief. With gentle movement, she returned the photo to its place on the shelf, positioning it exactly as it had been. Her fingers lingered on the frame for a moment before she turned away, picking up her crisp flight attendant uniform from where it lay draped across the back of a chair. The iron hissed as she plugged it in, waiting for it to heat up. "Tomorrow is another day," she murmured, smoothing out the wrinkles in her navy blue jacket. The familiar motion of ironing provided a strange comfort, the repetitive back and forth giving her something tangible to focus on besides the hollow ache in her chest. As she worked, the iron glided across the fabric with a soft swooshing sound, filling the silence of her apartment. It was a simple task, this preparation for another day in the skies, but it anchored her to the present when memories threatened to pull her under. Amara's heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as she made her way through Terminal A. The familiar buzz of travelers, rolling suitcases, and overhead announcements filled the air around her, creating the ever-present symphony of airport life. She adjusted her navy blue scarf, making sure it lay perfectly centered against her crisp uniform, her fingers lingering on the soft fabric for an extra moment of comfort. "Good morning," she called out to an elderly couple, her smile warm and practiced. The woman beamed back, clutching her husband's arm as they shuffled toward their gate, their matching floral luggage trailing behind them. Amara had mastered the art of appearing collected and cheerful, even when her heart felt heavy enough to sink through the terminal floor and into the earth below. At Gate A22, she joined her crew for the pre-flight briefing. The flight supervisor reviewed safety procedures while Amara's mind drifted to the family photo she'd held just hours before. The one she kept tucked away in her bedside drawer, its edges worn from years of handling. She forced herself to focus, nodding at appropriate moments and double-checking her emergency protocols list, her pen tapping softly against the clipboard. "Remember, folks, we're expecting a full flight to Chicago today," the supervisor concluded, closing his binder with a snap that echoed in the small meeting space. "Let's give these passengers our best service." As boarding time approached, Amara took her position at the gate entrance. She smoothed down her skirt and adjusted her cap, the familiar routine helping to steady her nerves like a well-worn prayer. The terminal buzzed with activity, business people typing frantically on laptops, their coffee cups perched precariously beside them, parents corralling excited children in bright summer clothes, elderly passengers requesting wheelchair assistance from harried gate agents. "Now boarding Group A," she announced into the microphone, her voice clear and professional, carrying across the waiting area. The first wave of passengers began making their way toward the jet bridge, rustling through their bags for last-minute items. Amara greeted each person with a gentle smile, checking boarding passes and directing travelers to their correct seats. "Welcome aboard," she repeated, the words becoming a soothing mantra that helped keep her grounded. A young mother struggled with a car seat, and Amara stepped forward to help, grateful for the distraction from her own thoughts. The boarding continued smoothly until Group C was called. That's when she saw them, a man and boy walking down the jet bridge. The man looked somehow familiar, though Amara couldn't quite place him. But it was the boy who made her heart stutter in her chest, sending a jolt of recognition through her entire body. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond his years. His curly hair, cut short but still showing its natural texture, was exactly like her Jace's would have been. He wore a blue and white striped polo shirt that hung slightly loose on his small frame. The boy's gaze met hers for a brief moment as he passed. Something flickered in those familiar eyes, recognition, fear, before he quickly looked away, his shoulders hunching forward as if trying to make himself smaller. Amara's hands found the back of the nearest passenger seat, gripping it for support as her legs threatened to give way beneath her. "No," she whispered, her throat constricting around the word, her perfectly maintained composure crumbling. "It can't be Jace." The boy and his companion continued down the aisle, disappearing into the cabin while Amara stood frozen, her professional demeanor cracking like thin ice beneath her feet. The sounds of the aircraft faded to a distant hum as her world narrowed to a single, heart-wrenching possibility. In the narrow confines of the airplane galley, Amara's fingers pressed against the metal counter until her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts as she tried to maintain her composure. The familiar sounds of the aircraft in flight, the steady hum of engines, the occasional ding of call buttons, the soft murmur of passengers, seemed distant and muffled compared to the thundering of her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to ground herself. 7 years of grief and uncertainty had taught her to be cautious with hope. But that face, those eyes, they were exactly as she remembered, only older. As if someone had taken her memory of Jace and advanced it by 7 years. Like one of those age progression photos the police had created during the initial search. Gathering her courage, Amara peered around the corner of the galley. Her eyes found them in row 14. The man beside the boy was slumped against the window, his mouth slightly open in sleep, his expensive suit wrinkled from the journey. The boy sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at the seat in front of him. It was such an unnaturally rigid posture for a child his age, as if he'd been trained to make himself as invisible as possible. A flight attendant passed by with the beverage cart, momentarily blocking her view. Amara pulled back into the galley, pressing a hand to her chest where her heart threatened to burst through. The resemblance was uncanny. The same high cheekbones she'd traced with her finger countless times, the identical curve of his nose that matched his father's, even the small birthmark near his hairline that she used to kiss goodnight. Even the way he held himself reminded her of Jace's serious nature, always so thoughtful and watchful. But it couldn't be possible, could it? The police had been so certain about the accident, yet there had always been something that didn't add up. The lack of dental records, the rushed investigation, the way Derek's body had never been properly identified. Each inconsistency had haunted her dreams for years. Taking a deep breath, Amara straightened her uniform and grabbed a stack of napkins, giving herself an excuse to move through the cabin. As she approached their row, her hands trembled slightly. She forced herself to maintain an even pace. Though every step felt like walking through deep water, her movements sluggish against the weight of possibility. When she reached row 14, the boy looked up. Their eyes met, and Amara felt the world tilt on its axis. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked by what looked like fear. His eyes darted away almost immediately, but not before Amara caught the subtle change in his expression, the way his shoulders tensed as if preparing to flee. She hurried back to the galley, her mind spinning with possibilities. Could it really be him? She whispered to herself, bracing against the counter once more. The question echoed in her mind, filling her thoughts with equal measures of terror and hope. Her fingers traced the outline of the locket she always wore beneath her uniform, the one containing the last photo taken of her twin boys together. Amara confides in her colleague, Lisa Nguyen, her colleague of 3 years, had always been a steady presence during turbulent times, both in the air and on the ground. They'd weathered countless challenging flights together, sharing stories and support during their long hours in the sky. "Lisa, I need your help," Amara whispered, her voice cracking with barely contained emotion. She glanced around nervously to ensure no other crew members were within earshot of their conversation. "There's a boy on this flight who looks exactly like my son, like Jace. It's like seeing a ghost." Lisa's dark eyes widened with concern, and she placed a gentle, steadying hand on Amara's trembling arm. "Are you sure? I know how much you've been through these past few years." "I know what you're thinking," Amara said, fumbling slightly as she pulled out her phone and quickly navigated to the treasured family photo she always kept close to her heart. "Look at this picture. The boy in row 14, he's identical, just older. Same eyes, Same little dimple when he frowns. Lisa studied the photo carefully, her expression shifting from concern to surprise as recognition dawned on her face. That's uncanny, she admitted, looking back toward the cabin with newfound interest. But Amara, your boys, the accident, they told you. Something never felt right about that night, Amara said, her voice urgent but quiet, weighted with years of doubt and suspicion. The investigation was rushed. There were no proper identifications, no concrete proof. She took a deep, steadying breath. Lisa, I need to talk to him. But the man he's with, I can't explain it, but something feels off, really off. Lisa's face set with determination, her years of friendship with Amar evident in her immediate support. What do you need me to do? Can you distract him, the man? Just keep him occupied for a few minutes? I need just enough time to be sure. Lisa nodded firmly, her mind already working through the possibilities. I'll offer him our premium drink selection. You know how I can talk someone's ear off about our artisanal spirits. She squeezed Amara's hand reassuringly. Just be careful, okay? And if you need backup, give me our signal. They waited for the right moment, watching as the cabin settled into the quiet lull of mid-flight, most passengers either dozing or absorbed in their entertainment. Lisa grabbed a drink cart and made her way down the aisle with practiced ease, her movements smooth and professional. She stopped at row 14, her voice warm and engaging as she leaned slightly toward the man. Sir, can I interest you in our premium beverage selection? We have a wonderful small batch bourbon that's exclusive to first class, but I'd be happy to make an exception. It has these lovely notes of vanilla and caramel. As Lisa kept the man thoroughly engaged in conversation, gesturing animatedly about the drinks and their unique qualities, Amara moved quietly to the row. Her heart pounded so hard she worried the whole plane could hear it, the sound thundering in her ears. She knelt beside the boy's seat, keeping her movements slow and gentle, trying not to startle him. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the worn family photo, its edges softened from years of handling. The boy's eyes darted between her face and the picture, and Amara saw a flash of something in his expression, recognition, fear, confusion, all mixed together in a way that made her heart ache. I'm your mom, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady drone of the engine noise. The boy stared at the photo, his small hands clenching and unclenching nervously in his lap. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy she remembered from those precious years before. But there was something else there too, a wariness that no child should have to carry, a shadow behind his eyes that spoke of secrets and fear. I don't know, he began hesitantly, then leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower, trembling with urgency. Don't tell him. He'll hurt me. His eyes darted fearfully toward the man still chatting with Lisa before adding in an even softer whisper that made Amara's blood run cold. And Jordan's gone. Her heart ached as she noticed his careful movements, the way his shoulders tensed when he passed the sleeping man. His small frame seemed to shrink even further as he made his way toward the rear lavatory, his steps hesitant and measured like those of a much older soul. As he passed her, his small hand brushed against hers with deliberate precision, the touch so light it was barely perceptible. A crumpled piece of paper passed between them, so quick and subtle that anyone watching might have missed it. Amara's fingers closed around it instinctively, her professional smile never wavering, even as her pulse raced beneath her calm exterior. Years of service had taught her how to maintain composure even in the most challenging situations, how to keep her face serene while her heart thundered in her chest. She waited until he disappeared into the restroom before retreating to the galley, her movements measured and routine, just another flight attendant going about her duties. Her hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the worn paper, smoothing out the creases with fingers that shook despite her best efforts to steady them. The paper felt delicate, as if it had been folded and unfolded countless times, carrying its secret message through unknown trials. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat, a soft gasp escaping her lips. It was a photograph, torn and weathered at the edges, its colors slightly faded from handling. Not just any photograph, it was identical to the one she kept in her apartment, the one taken at Memorial Park 7 years ago on that perfect autumn afternoon. The same sunny day, the same bright smiles, the same red balloon floating above Jordan's head, caught in a moment of pure joy. But this copy was different. It had been torn in half, separating the twins in a way that felt brutally symbolic, like a visual representation of her fractured family. Below the image, written in shaky child's handwriting that spoke of desperation and fear, was an address. 1247, Pine Grove Road, Marietta. Tears welled in Amara's eyes as she traced the familiar faces in the photo, her fingertip gentle against the worn surface, as if touching them too firmly might make them disappear. Her fingers lingered on the torn edge where Jordan should have been, the jagged paper a painful reminder of what had been lost. The boy's earlier words echoed in her mind. "Jordan's gone." The weight of those words pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe, crushing her with their implications and the possibilities they held. Lisa appeared beside her, keeping her voice low and concerned, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of Amara's emotions. "Everything okay?" Her eyes held the knowing look of someone who had witnessed Amara's pain before. Amara quickly tucked the paper into her pocket, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand and struggling to compose herself, to find her professional demeanor again. "He gave me this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, barely able to get the words past the lump in her throat. "It's the same photo I have at home, Lisa. The exact same one, down to the very last detail." They both watched as the bathroom door opened and the boy emerged, his movements cautious and deliberate, like a small animal aware of nearby predators. He walked back to his seat with the same careful movements, sliding in next to the still sleeping man who hadn't stirred, his body tense as if preparing for sudden movement. As he settled in, his eyes met Amara's briefly, filled with a mixture of hope and fear that made her heart clench with maternal protectiveness, stirring memories of bedtime stories and gentle hugs. She gripped the counter of the galley, her knuckles white with determination, her wedding ring pressing into her finger like a reminder of promises both kept and broken. The address burned in her pocket like a beacon of hope, a chance to make things right after so many years of wondering and waiting, of sleepless nights spent imagining worst-case scenarios. As she watched him return to his seat, Amara felt an overwhelming sense of urgency course through her veins, mixing with the fierce protective instinct that had never truly left her, only grown stronger with each passing year. "I will protect you this time," she vowed silently, her jaw set with determination, her entire being focused on this one promise. "No matter what it takes." Amara leaned against the galley wall, memories flooding back as the plane cruised through darkening skies. Her. A particular memory surfaced, sharp and clear as broken glass. It was a Sunday morning, the kind that should have been quiet and peaceful. The autumn sun streamed through their kitchen window, casting warm golden light on the countertops. But the scene was anything but tranquil. Amara stood by the sink, folding a dish towel, her movements deliberate as she tried to calm the tightening in her chest. She had mentioned casually, too casually perhaps, her plan to visit her sister in Chicago for the weekend. A visit she desperately needed, not just to see her sister, but to escape the oppressive tension that had grown too familiar at home. Derek had been leaning against the counter, a steaming coffee cup in his hand. At first he said nothing, and she dared to hope he would brush it off as insignificant. But then he spoke, his tone deceptively soft. "Why would you need to go there?" His words hung in the air like a trap, the coffee cup handle creaking under the pressure of his grip. Amara froze, her back to him, her fingers gripping the towel tightly. "It's just a weekend visit," she said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. "I thought it would be nice to take the boys. They've been asking about their aunt." Derek's laugh was low and mirthless, sending a shiver down her spine. "The boys," he repeated, his voice laced with mockery. "You know they need stability, structure. Everything they need is right here." She turned to face him then, hoping the smile she forced onto her face would disarm him. "It's just 2 days, Derek. They'll still have their routine. I thought it would be good for all of us." His eyes darkened, narrowing in a way that made her throat tighten. He set the coffee cup down with deliberate care, the sound of ceramic meeting the counter louder than it should have been. "Good for all of us," he repeated slowly, stepping closer to her. "You don't make decisions for this family. That's my job." Amar instinctively stepped back, her hands trembling as she clutched the towel. "It's not a big deal," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just—" "You were just what?" Derek interrupted, his voice sharp now, cutting through her attempt to pacify him. "Trying to take my sons away, trying to undermine me in my own home." Her breath hitched, and she shook her head quickly. "No, of course not." "Good," he snapped, his presence looming over her as he leaned in. "Because let me remind you, Amara, everything you have is because of me. You're not taking my boys anywhere." The tears she'd fought so hard to hold back welled up then, but she swallowed them down. She knew better than to cry in front of him. Crying only made him angrier. She nodded, lowering her gaze to the floor. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We won't go." "That's better," Derek said, his tone returning to that falsely sweet calmness that chilled her more than his anger. He picked up his coffee cup again, taking a slow sip as if nothing had happened. "Now, let's have a nice family day. Go get the boys ready." Amara nodded mechanically, turning away to hide the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She clutched the dish towel tightly, as if it could somehow anchor her in the midst of the chaos that had become her life. The final argument rushed back to her now, playing like a horror movie she couldn't stop. It was the night before the supposed accident. She'd found documents in his office, papers with different names, bank accounts she'd never known about, and photographs that made her blood run cold. When she'd confronted him, his mask had finally slipped completely. "You think you can threaten me?" he'd snarled, his handsome face twisted with rage, throwing the papers across the room. "You're nothing without me. Those boys are mine. Don't forget who puts food on this table." The next day, he'd taken the twins for that fun drive, promising ice cream and adventure. Hours later, the police were at her door with news of the explosion, their faces grave as they delivered words that would shatter her world. The plane began its descent, jolting Amara back to the present. She gripped the counter as the cabin lights brightened, watching as passengers stirred and gathered their belongings. Her eyes fixed on row 14, where the man, Derek, was now awake, helping the boy collect his backpack with movements that seemed caring to anyone else but her. The overhead lights caught his profile, and Amara's breath hitched. Though his hair was shorter now, graying slightly at the temples, she'd know that face anywhere. The way he held himself, the calculated efficiency of his movements, it was unmistakably Derek. He was alive, had been alive all these years, while she'd mourned empty graves and lived with crushing guilt that ate at her soul every single day. Her hands trembled as she watched them prepare to deplane. Derek's posture was relaxed, confident, the stance of a man who thought himself untouchable. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture that might have looked fatherly to others, but Amara saw the subtle tension in her son's frame, the slight flinch that spoke volumes. Rage and fear battled within her as she observed them from her position near the front galley. Rage at the years stolen from her, fear for her son still trapped in Derek's grasp. She took slow, measured breaths, forcing herself to remain professional as passengers began filing out. She couldn't risk alerting Derek to her presence, couldn't let him see the recognition in her eyes. One wrong move could send him running again, taking her son with him. As they moved toward the exit, Amara made her decision. She would follow them, carefully and quietly, like a shadow. She had lost her boys once to this man's deception, had spent countless nights crying into empty beds and staring at photograph albums. She wouldn't lose them again. This time would be different. This time, she would fight back. Amara and Lisa moved swiftly through the bustling terminal, keeping a careful distance from Derek and the boy. Lisa's petite frame made it easy for her to weave through the crowd while staying inconspicuous, her practiced movements reflecting years of navigating packed cabins. "They're heading to Gate B23, Lisa whispered, her dark eyes tracking their movements with laser focus. "I'll circle around to the coffee shop for a better view. The morning rush should give us good cover." Amara nodded, her hands steady as she raised her phone to snap photos, though her heart thundered in her chest. Through the camera lens, she captured Derek checking the flight information board, his hand still gripping the boy's shoulder with unmistakable possessiveness. Her heart ached at the sight of her son's stiff posture and downcast eyes, his shoulders hunched forward in a defensive stance she'd never seen before. "The luggage tag," Lisa murmured through their connected phone call, her voice barely audible above the airport announcements. "Black suitcase, can you see it? Try to get the whole thing." Amara zoomed in with her camera, focusing on the bag at Derek's feet. The tag was partially visible. She could make out what looked like a California address, the letters slightly blurred but readable. She took several shots in quick succession, making sure to capture every detail, even the airline's priority tags. When Derek approached the counter to check in, Amara positioned herself at a nearby gate, pretending to review flight schedules while straining to hear their conversation. Her years as a flight attendant helped her appear natural in the airport environment. The boarding passes exchanged hands. Los Angeles was their destination, confirming her suspicions. "Got it," she texted Lisa. "LAX. He's really taking him across the country." Lisa appeared beside her, coffee cup in hand as perfect cover, the steam rising between them like a shield. "I heard them talking about connecting through Dallas first. They'll have a 2-hour layover." Amara's fingers flew over her phone screen, pulling up the airline's booking system with practiced ease. Her heart raced as she found the flight number and available seats, thankful for her employee access. The price made her wince, nearly her entire month's savings, but she didn't hesitate for even a second. "This is our chance," she said, completing the purchase with trembling fingers. "I can't lose them again. Not after coming this far." They watched as Derek and the boy made their way through security, joining the long line of travelers. Amara's throat tightened when her son glanced back, his eyes scanning the crowd briefly before Derek urged him forward with a firm push. "I'll get your next shift covered," Lisa assured her, squeezing her arm with sisterly affection. "Just be careful, okay? You know what Derek's capable of." Amara hugged her friend quickly, grateful for her unwavering support. "Thank you, Lisa, for everything. I couldn't do this alone." At the gate, Amara kept her distance, her uniform now covered by a light jacket she'd brought specifically for this purpose. She observed as Derek and the boy settled into their seats in the waiting area. The boy pulled out a book, hunching over it as if trying to make himself smaller, disappear into the pages. The boarding process began, and Amara watched them join the line, her stomach churning with anxiety and determination. Her heart pounded as they disappeared down the jet bridge. She waited until the final boarding call before approaching the gate herself, ticket in hand, her face a mask of casual indifference. "This time, I won't let them disappear," she whispered, stepping onto the jet bridge, her resolve hardening with each step. "Not again. Not ever." The connecting flight to Los Angeles hummed steadily through the night sky, the gentle vibrations a constant reminder of their journey westward. Amara sat 4 rows behind Derek, and who she now knew was definitely Jace, her heart aching with each glimpse of her son. She had changed into civilian clothes, comfortable jeans and a soft gray sweater, to blend in seamlessly with other passengers, her flight attendant uniform carefully stowed in her carry-on. From her strategically chosen vantage point, she could observe their interactions without drawing attention. Every time Derek spoke to Jace, his words came out as harsh whispers, his jaw tight with barely contained anger, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. The boy would nod quickly, his shoulders hunched defensively, responding with short, clipped answers that seemed rehearsed. When the drink service came around, Jace accidentally knocked over his cup of water, sending the liquid spreading across his tray table. Derek's hand shot out like a snake striking, gripping the boy's wrist with unmistakable force. Though his voice remained low, Amara could see the violence in his posture, the way his knuckles whitened, and how Jace seemed to shrink into himself, trying to become invisible. "I'm sorry, sir," Jace whispered, dabbing frantically at the spill with a handful of white napkins. His hands trembled visibly as he worked, his movements quick and nervous like a frightened bird. The sight made Amara's stomach turn, bile rising in her throat. She remembered similar moments from her marriage, Derek's sudden flashes of anger, the way he could make the smallest mistake feel like a catastrophe, how the air would grow thick with tension before the storm broke. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft blue glow. One by one, passengers drifted off to sleep, the cabin filling with the gentle sounds of deep breathing and occasional snores. Amara watched intently as Derek's head finally lolled to the side, his breathing becoming deep and regular, his grip on control momentarily loosened by exhaustion. She waited 15 carefully counted minutes to be sure he was truly asleep before making her move. With practiced quiet from years of midnight flight service, she slipped into the empty seat across the aisle from Jace, her movements fluid and silent. The boy tensed when she sat down, his body going rigid, but recognition flickered in his eyes like a tiny flame of hope. "It's okay," Amara whispered, keeping her voice barely audible above the steady engine noise. "I need to know about Jordan. Where is your brother?" Jace glanced nervously at Derek before leaning slightly closer to Amara, his voice trembling. "He took Jordan away last year," he whispered back, his voice breaking on his twin's name. "Said he was sending him somewhere to learn respect. I haven't seen him since. Not once." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes, threatening to spill over. "Did he hurt you? Either of you?" Jace's silence was answer enough, heavy with unspoken pain. He fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, twisting the fabric between his fingers, a gesture so familiar it made Amara's heart ache with recognition. "Dad has connections," he finally said, each word careful and weighted. "Bad people. That's where he sent Jordan. He says if I don't behave, I'll go too. He makes sure I remember that." Anger surged through Amara's body, hot and fierce like wildfire. She wanted to wake Derek right then, to confront him about everything he'd done to their family. But she forced herself to stay calm for Jace's sake, swallowing back the rage that threatened to overwhelm her. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite her fury. Her eyes locked on her son's face. "I'm going to find Jordan. I promise you that. And I'm going to get you both somewhere safe. Somewhere he can never reach you again." Jace's eyes darted to Derek again, fear evident in his expression, his lower lip trembling slightly. "You don't understand," he whispered urgently, leaning even closer. "He's dangerous, really dangerous. The things he's done, the people he knows." "I know," Amara assured him, fighting back tears as she resisted the overwhelming urge to pull him into her arms. "But I'm your mother, and I'm not going to lose either of you again. Not ever. I'll find Jordan, I promise. Whatever it takes." In the dimly lit hotel room, Amara sat cross-legged on the bed, her laptop casting a blue glow across her face. The torn piece of paper Jace had given her lay smoothed out beside her keyboard, its edges wrinkled from being crumpled in his small fist. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the address into the search bar, the late-night silence broken only by the soft tapping of keys and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Outside, the muted sounds of city traffic drifted up from the streets below, a constant reminder of the world moving on while her life stood frozen in this moment of discovery. "Miami Preparatory Academy," she murmured, reading the school's name that appeared on her screen. The website showed a pristine campus with manicured lawns and colonial-style buildings. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. The promotional videos featured students in crisp uniforms walking between classes, their faces showing practiced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Each carefully staged photo seemed designed to project an image of excellence and order that made her skin crawl. Jace's frightened words echoed in her mind. "Don't trust him." She could still see the fear in his eyes when he'd whispered those words on the plane, his small hand clutching her sleeve as if seeking protection from an invisible threat. The memory of his trembling voice made her heart ache, with a mother's desperate need to protect her child. Scrolling through the faculty pages, Amara's breath caught in her throat. There, among the administrative staff, was a familiar face with an unfamiliar name, Daniel Richards, Director of Student Affairs. The photo showed Derek in a suit and tie, his smile as false as everything else about him. Even through the screen, his eyes held that calculating gleam she'd learned to recognize too late. The same eyes that had once looked at her with pretended love now stared back at her with cold professionalism. "You've been here all along," she whispered, her fingers clenching into fists. The image of Derek in his professional attire made her stomach turn. While she'd spent years grieving, believing her family was dead, he'd been building a new life under a false identity, walking the halls of this school as if he belonged there. Each day he'd played his role, attending meetings and shaping young minds, while her world had crumbled into ash. Amara dug deeper into the school's background, her investigative skills honed from years of quiet observation as a flight attendant. Public records revealed that Daniel Richards had joined the school's administration 3 years ago, right around the time Jordan disappeared. Her heart ached, thinking about how much time had been stolen from them. She clicked through document after document, each new piece of information fueling her determination. The pieces started falling into place like a terrible puzzle. The school's remote location, tucked away behind wrought iron gates, the strict security measures mentioned in their policies, the emphasis on behavioral correction in their program description. It wasn't just a school, it was a prison. She noticed how the campus photos never showed the same students twice, how the testimonials were vague and impersonal. Every detail seemed carefully crafted to hide something sinister beneath its polished surface. Rage bubbled up inside her as she stared at Derek's smiling photograph. He hadn't just faked his death. He'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to separate their family. The car accident, the fire that supposedly destroyed all evidence, the years of deception, it had all been carefully planned. Like moves in a chess game where she and her sons were merely pawns. Her fingers traced the screen, remembering the man she thought she'd known, now transformed into this stranger, wearing her husband's face. Her hands shook as she clicked through more documents, each revelation stoking her anger. Property records showed the school was owned by a shell corporation, and buried in the financial statements was a connection to other businesses, all linked to Daniel Richards. The web of deceit stretched far beyond what she'd imagined, each discovery making her feel sick to her stomach. She opened a new document, methodically recording every connection, every suspicious detail that might help her unravel this twisted scheme. "You've been hiding in plain sight," Amara said through gritted teeth, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. The man she'd once loved, the father of her children, had become something unrecognizable, a monster wearing a respectable mask. The soft glow of the laptop screen illuminated the determination in her eyes as she began taking notes, preparing herself for the fight ahead. Her maternal instinct, dormant for so long in her grief, now roared to life with renewed purpose. She would tear down every wall, expose every lie, and bring her family back together, no matter the cost. Amara, dressed inconspicuously, visits the private school and speaks with the receptionist. Amara pulled her rental car into the visitor parking lot of Miami Preparatory Academy. She adjusted her blazer and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, making sure she looked the part of a prospective parent. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she'd chosen understated jewelry to complete her professional appearance. The weight of her wedding ring, which she'd put on for this performance, felt foreign on her finger after so many years. The main office building loomed before her, its colonial architecture somehow both welcoming and imposing. Palm trees swayed in the morning breeze as she walked up the stone steps, her sensible heels clicking against the pavement. Students in crisp uniforms hurried past her, their backpacks bouncing as they rushed to their first classes of the day. Inside, the air conditioning hit her like a wall of cold relief from the Miami heat. The reception area gleamed with polished marble floors and dark wood paneling. Trophy cases lined the walls, displaying the school's academic and athletic achievements. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes looked up from behind a curved desk. "Good morning," Amara said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Her palms felt clammy, but she maintained her practiced smile. "I'm interested in enrolling my son for the upcoming semester." The receptionist, whose nameplate read Mrs. Martinez, brightened immediately. "Of course. Please have a seat. I can provide you with our information packet and answer any questions." She began pulling glossy brochures from a drawer, arranging them with practiced efficiency. As Mrs. Martinez gathered materials, Amara settled into a plush leather chair. She noticed a framed photo of the administrative staff on the wall, Derek's false smile prominent among them. His arm was draped around another teacher's shoulders in a show of camaraderie that made her stomach turn. "I've heard wonderful things about Mr. Richards," Amara ventured carefully, her fingers tracing the edge of her purse. "He seems very involved with the students." Mrs. Martinez's smile flickered slightly. "Oh yes, Mr. Richards. He's certainly dedicated." She hesitated before continuing, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "Though lately he's been rather irregular with his attendance. Between us, it's caused some confusion with the accounts." Amara leaned forward, feigning concern. "Oh? That's concerning. I want to make sure the school is stable before making any decisions." She watched the older woman's face carefully, noting every micro-expression. The receptionist lowered her voice, glancing at the empty hallway. "Well, we've had some issues with late payments from families. Mr. Richards handles those matters, but—" She glanced around before continuing. "Several parents have complained about missing documentation. The headmaster is looking into it, very quietly, of course." As they discussed the school's programs, Amara carefully steered the conversation toward the current students. "I noticed a young boy earlier seemed quite withdrawn. Is that typical of the students here?" Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for the response. Mrs. Martinez's expression softened with concern. "Ah, you must mean Jace. Poor thing hardly speaks to anyone. The teachers worry, but Mr. Richards insists everything's fine at home." She shook her head slightly, maternal worry evident in her features. "We try to provide extra support, but there's only so much we can do without parental cooperation." The casual mention of her son's name sent a sharp pain through Amara's chest. She gripped her purse tighter, thinking of Jace walking these halls alone, carrying burdens no child should bear. The leather handle creaked under her fingers. "Does he have any friends?" Amara asked, struggling to keep her voice neutral. A bell rang somewhere in the building, followed by the distant sound of slamming lockers and chattering students. "He keeps to himself mostly," Mrs. Martinez replied, absently organizing the pens on her desk. "Sometimes he sits alone during lunch, just drawing in his notebook. The counselor tried to reach out, but Mr. Richards—" She stopped herself, apparently realizing she'd said too much. Her fingers nervously adjusted her reading glasses. Amara's heart felt heavy as she imagined Jace isolated and afraid, trapped in this gilded cage while Derek maintained his facade of respectability. The knowledge that her son spent his days in silent suffering made her want to cry out, to run through the halls calling his name. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she fought to maintain her composure. Through the window behind Mrs. Martinez's desk, she could see children playing on the playground, their laughter a stark contrast to the darkness she felt closing in around her. Amara follows Derek from the school to a gated neighborhood. Amara's rental car idled quietly 2 blocks away from Miami Preparatory Academy as she watched Derek's black SUV pull out of the faculty parking lot. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white as she waited for him to pass, then smoothly merged into traffic several cars behind him, careful to keep other vehicles between them. The route wound through increasingly upscale neighborhoods, past manicured lawns and Mediterranean-style homes with perfectly trimmed hedges and bubbling fountains. Derek's SUV finally turned into The Palms, an exclusive gated community with towering royal palms lining its entrance like silent sentinels. Amara pulled over on a side street with a clear view of the gate, her heart pounding against her ribs as she watched him punch in the security code. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and zoomed in, capturing photos of his license plate and the house number displayed on his ornate mailbox. The home was impressive, a 2-story stucco mansion with a red tile roof, arched windows, and carefully landscaped grounds dotted with tropical flowers. It made her stomach churn to think how he could afford such luxury while neglecting their son, leaving him to suffer God knows where. For the next hour, Amara documented Derek's movements through the large front windows, thankful for the tinted windows of her rental car. He paced while on phone calls, disappearing and reappearing between rooms like a restless ghost. She noted the times in her phone with meticulous detail, building a record of his routine and searching for any patterns that might help her case. "What are you hiding in there?" she whispered through clenched teeth, zooming in to photograph him arguing animatedly with someone on the phone, his face contorted with anger. As afternoon faded into evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Derek emerged from the house in different clothes, trading his professional attire for dark jeans and a leather jacket that seemed out of place in the upscale neighborhood. He got into his SUV and pulled out of the gates, heading in the opposite direction from the school. Amara followed at a safe distance as the neighborhoods grew progressively rougher. Gone were the pristine lawns and luxury cars, replaced by rundown apartment complexes with broken windows and abandoned storefronts covered in layers of graffiti. The streets narrowed, lined with people lounging on broken stoops and conducting quick exchanges in shadowy doorways, their suspicious glances making her skin crawl. Her palms grew slick with sweat as she gripped the steering wheel, keeping Derek's SUV in sight while trying to remain inconspicuous in an area where she clearly didn't belong. She had no idea what she might discover, but something deep in her gut told her this part of his double life could lead her to answers about Jordan's disappearance. Derek slowed near a dilapidated warehouse with boarded-up windows and crumbling brick walls. The flickering streetlights cast eerie shadows across its graffiti-covered walls, creating menacing shapes in the growing darkness. Amara's heart hammered in her chest as she watched him park and exit his vehicle, looking furtively over his shoulder before disappearing inside the building through a rusty side door. Amara watches from her parked car as Derek meets a man in a dark alley. Amara killed the engine and switched off her headlights, shrinking down in her seat as she watched Derek's silhouette move through the shadows. Her rental car was parked just far enough away to avoid detection, yet close enough to observe the meeting unfolding in the dimly lit alley. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. The familiar scent of fear filled her nostrils, a mixture of cold sweat and the metallic taste of adrenaline. A stocky man in a dark hoodie emerged from behind the warehouse, his face obscured by both the hood and the deep shadows cast by the building. His heavy boots scraped against the rough asphalt with each step. Derek greeted him with a quick handshake, both men glancing nervously over their shoulders like guilty ravens. Amara's fingers shook as she raised her phone, activating the camera's night mode, praying the slight trembling wouldn't blur the images. "The Jordan situation is getting complicated," the hooded man's gruff voice carried on the evening breeze, cutting through the distant sound of traffic and the low hum of the city. "People are asking questions. Too many questions." Amara's breath caught in her throat, and she had to remind herself to keep breathing. She steadied her hands against the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension, zooming in to capture clearer images of the exchange. The mention of Jordan's name made her stomach twist into knots, and bile rose in the back of her throat. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to rush forward, to demand answers, but she forced herself to remain still. "I told you to handle it," Derek hissed, his voice sharp with anger, his shoulders tensing visibly even from this distance. A nearby street lamp cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the cruel set of his jaw. "That's what I pay you for. Good money, too." "It's not that simple anymore." The man shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. His hands fidgeted with the edges of his hoodie sleeves. "The boy's been writing letters. If they get out, if anyone connects the dots." "Then make sure they don't," Derek cut him off, jabbing a finger into the man's chest with enough force to make him step back. "Double the usual payment. Just keep him quiet. Whatever it takes." Tears blurred Amara's vision as she continued taking photos, her hands now trembling so badly she had to brace her elbows against the car door. Her son was alive. Jordan was alive somewhere, and these men were keeping him hidden. The revelation sent waves of simultaneous relief and horror through her body, making her feel lightheaded and sick at the same time. Her chest ached with a mixture of hope and despair. The hooded man reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, the paper looking worn at the edges, its corners softened from repeated handling. This month's paperwork. All the accounts are clean. Nobody will trace anything back to you. Derek snatched the envelope and thumbed through its contents with practiced efficiency, his movements quick and precise. The street light caught his face, revealing the cold calculation in his eyes that Amara remembered all too well from their marriage. That same look he'd worn whenever he was plotting something cruel. It was the expression that had haunted her nightmares for years. As she watched him tuck the envelope into his jacket, her voice came out as a broken whisper, thick with unshed tears and years of accumulated pain. "What have you done to my boys, Derek? What kind of monster have you become?" Amara secretly meets with Jace in a park. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the trees at Riverside Park as Amara sat on a weathered wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd chosen this spot carefully, close enough to the playground to seem natural, but far enough from other parents to have privacy. Her heart raced as she watched Jace approach, his small figure darting between the trees like a frightened sparrow. "Hi," he whispered, settling beside her but keeping a careful distance. His eyes darted around constantly, scanning for danger in every shadow. He wore a blue t-shirt that seemed a size too small, and Amara noticed a fading bruise on his forearm that made her stomach clench. "Are you okay?" Amara asked softly, fighting the urge to reach out and touch him. She knew she needed to move slowly, to let him set the pace of their interaction. Jace glanced over his shoulder for the third time in less than a minute. His fingers twisted the hem of his shirt nervously as he spoke, his voice barely audible above the distant laughter of children on the playground. "He hurt Jordan. He said he sent him away because I'm too soft." Amara's breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to remain still, though every maternal instinct screamed at her to gather him in her arms. "Can you tell me more?" "Jordan was stronger than me," Jace continued, his voice trembling. "He would fight back when—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "But that made him angry, really angry." A group of joggers passed nearby, and Jace flinched, shrinking further into himself. When they passed, he reached into his pocket with shaking hands. "We used to write to each other," he said softly, pulling out a crumpled, partially burned piece of paper. "After he took Jordan away." Amara watched as her son's trembling fingers extended toward her, offering the letter. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and she felt him withdraw instantly, as if burned by the contact. A flash of pain crossed his face, and he tucked his hands protectively against his chest. Her heart shattered a little more as she carefully unfolded the damaged paper, trying not to let her own hands shake. The letter was written in a child's unsteady hand, the words desperate and pleading. Tear stains had warped the paper in places, making some of the pencil marks blur. "Dear Jace," it began, "please help me. I'm scared. They keep me in a dark room. I don't know where I am. I miss you. Please find me." The rest was blackened and unreadable, the paper's edges crisp with burn marks, as if someone had tried to destroy the evidence but hadn't quite succeeded. Small fragments of words peeked through the char, a half-formed help here, what might have been basement there, but the message was lost to the flames. In her dimly lit hotel room, Amara spread the charred letter fragments across the desk. The lamp cast a warm glow over the burned paper as she carefully arranged each piece like a delicate puzzle. Her hands trembled as she used tweezers to handle the most fragile sections, afraid they might crumble at the slightest touch. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to the papers, making her eyes water slightly. Certain words stood out starkly against the darkened paper. "Scared" appeared multiple times, each instance making her heart clench. "Help" was scrawled in increasingly desperate handwriting, the letters growing larger and more frantic toward the edges. She pulled out her phone and began photographing each fragment, zooming in to study the details, her breath catching with each new discovery. In the corner of one piece, partially obscured by burn marks, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The letters "have" followed by what looked like an N. Another fragment mentioned "by the water," an old factory. Her mind raced as she connected the dots, her maternal instinct screaming that this was important. Reaching for her laptop, Amara's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for any facility called The Haven near Miami. After several frustrating dead ends, she refined her search to include abandoned factories near water. A news article from 5 years ago caught her attention. Former industrial site, The Haven, faces demolition delays. Her heart pounded as she clicked the link. She clicked through old photographs of a sprawling complex by the waterfront, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. The article mentioned ongoing legal disputes preventing its demolition, leaving it in limbo, empty but standing. The building's haunting images sent chills down her spine as she imagined Jordan somewhere inside those walls. With shaking hands, Amara dialed Marcus's number. Despite the late hour, he answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but concerned. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice urgent. "Can you come to my hotel? I think I found something big." 20 minutes later, Marcus arrived, his usually neat appearance slightly rumpled from being called out so late. His dark eyes were alert, though, scanning the fragments spread across the desk as Amara explained her findings. The streetlight filtering through the thin curtains cast shadows across his worried face. "Look here," she said, pointing to the partial word with trembling fingers. "And here's where Jordan mentions water and an old building. I found this place called The Haven. It fits everything he described. It has to be more than coincidence." Marcus leaned closer, studying the fragments with his practiced investigator's eye. He pulled out his phone and began taking his own photos, occasionally nodding as Amara spoke. The room fell silent except for the soft click of his phone camera and their measured breathing. "This could be it," he said finally, straightening up and running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The location makes sense. It's isolated enough to hide illegal activities, but close enough to transport people in and out without drawing attention." He paused, looking at Amara seriously. "We need to act fast, but we also need to be smart about this." Amara nodded, picking up the family photo from the desk. Her thumb brushed over the twins' smiling faces, touching the glossy surface as if she could reach through it to hold them. "We'll find him," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions in her chest. The Haven's pristine lobby gleamed under bright fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to its decrepit exterior. Amara adjusted her designer blazer, borrowed from Lisa, and gripped her leather portfolio tighter as she approached the reception desk. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor, each step measured and purposeful. "Good morning, I'm Alexandra Porter from the Waterfront Foundation," she said smoothly, channeling the confidence she'd practiced in front of her hotel mirror. "I have an appointment to discuss potential funding opportunities." The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and an overly bright smile, typed quickly on her keyboard. "Yes, Ms. Porter. Mr. Reynolds will be with you shortly. Please have a seat." Amara settled into one of the plush chairs, pretending to review documents while carefully observing her surroundings. Security cameras dotted the corners of the ceiling, their red lights blinking steadily. Men in dark suits moved through the lobby with purposeful strides, speaking in hushed tones. Something about their demeanor reminded her of Derek, that same controlled intensity. A tall man in an expensive suit emerged from a corridor, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Ms. Porter, I'm James Reynolds, Executive Director. Thank you for considering the Haven for your foundation's charitable giving. As they toured the facility, Amara maintained her facade of interested philanthropy, asking carefully rehearsed questions about their programs and funding needs. Reynolds led her through various rooms, each more polished than the last, speaking enthusiastically about their youth development initiatives. We believe in giving troubled young people a fresh start, Reynolds explained, gesturing to a wall of framed photographs. These are some of our success stories. Amara's breath caught in her throat. Among the dozens of smiling faces, one photograph stood out like a beacon. A boy with familiar features stared back at her, his smile not quite masking the sadness in his eyes. Though his hair was cut differently and he wore different clothes, she would know her son anywhere. Jordan's face, captured in this sterile setting, made her heart race. While Reynolds continued his practice speech about rehabilitation, Amara casually pulled out her phone, pretending to check an email. With steady hands that belied her internal turmoil, she quickly snapped several pictures of the photograph and its surroundings. "This is it," she murmured under her breath, careful to keep her expression neutral as she slipped her phone back into her pocket. The proof she needed had been hiding in plain sight, displayed on their very walls. "I'm particularly impressed by your commitment to these young people," she said aloud, forcing herself to maintain eye contact with Reynolds. Inside, her maternal instincts screamed to tear the building apart until she found Jordan, but she knew she had to play this smart. The evening air hung heavy with tension as Amara stood on the manicured lawn of Derek's suburban home. The perfectly trimmed hedges and pristine flower beds, a stark contrast to the ugliness she knew lay beneath this picture-perfect facade. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she kept her stance firm as she watched him pull into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The familiar silver Mercedes came to a stop, its polished surface gleaming in the fading daylight, and Derek emerged, his expression changing from surprise to annoyance when he spotted her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold and controlled, like ice over deep water. Amara stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging half-moons into her palms. "You lied to me. About everything." Her voice trembled with barely contained rage, years of pain bubbling to the surface. "What have you done to Jordan?" Derek's face twisted into a cruel smile as he closed his car door with a precise click. "You're supposed to be grieving, Amara. Moving on with your life." He adjusted his expensive suit jacket, brushing away invisible lint as if she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Instead, you're here making wild accusations." "Wild accusations?" Amara's voice rose, echoing across the quiet suburban street. "I saw Jace on that plane. I know he's alive, which means you faked that accident. You took my boys from me." Her chest heaved with emotion, tears threatening to spill. "You sound delusional," Derek laughed, the sound sharp and mocking, cutting through the evening air like a knife. "Is this what you've become? Some crazy woman chasing ghosts?" He moved toward his front door, keys jingling in his hand, dismissing her presence. "Go home, Amara. Get help." "The Haven," Amara said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. Derek froze, his hand on the doorknob, knuckles whitening. The smirk slipped from his face as he slowly turned back to face her, all pretense of civility vanishing. "What did you say?" His voice had lost its mocking edge, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. "You heard me." Amara met his gaze steadily, refusing to back down. "The Haven. That's where you sent Jordan, isn't it?" Derek's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Amara glimpsed the dangerous man lurking beneath his polished exterior. like a shark beneath calm waters. He stepped closer, invading her space, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You don't know what you're getting into," he warned, his eyes cold and empty as winter sky. "Stay away from things you don't understand." Without another word, he turned and stormed inside, the door slamming behind him with a force that shook the frame. Amara stood her ground, staring at the closed door, the evening breeze rustling through her hair. "I'm not backing down," she whispered fiercely, her determination hardening like steel. "Not this time. Not when my boys need me." Marcus spread the documents across the hotel room's small desk, his weathered hands carefully arranging bank statements and transaction records like pieces of a sinister puzzle. Amara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the complex web of numbers and dates that painted a disturbing picture of her ex-husband's activities. The dim desk lamp cast long shadows across the papers, making the figures seem even more ominous. "Look at these transfers," Marcus said, pointing to a series of highlighted figures with his pen. Every 3 months, like clockwork, large sums moved from Derek's accounts through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, finally ending up at something called Haven Holdings. His finger traced the paper trail, connecting the dots of deception. "It's sophisticated money laundering, planned with precision." Amara sank into the chair beside him, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the statements. The paper felt heavy with the weight of terrible secrets. "How much?" she whispered, dreading the answer. "Millions," Marcus replied, his voice heavy with disgust. "The pattern started right after the staged accident. He's been moving money consistently ever since, building his empire on lies." The fluorescent light hummed overhead as Amara studied the documents, each page revealing more of Derek's betrayal. Her throat tightened as she noticed the dates. They aligned perfectly with major events in their lives, including the night he took the boys. Every transaction felt like another knife in her heart. "There's more," Marcus said quietly, sliding another folder toward her with reluctance. "The Haven isn't just a facility. It's part of a larger network that deals in—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, his face reflecting his revulsion. "They traffic children across borders, Amara. They give them new identities, new papers. They make kids disappear." Amara's stomach lurched violently. The room seemed to spin as the pieces clicked into place. Derek's sudden wealth, Jordan's disappearance, the burned letters between the twins. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white, the wood digging into her palms. "He sold him," she breathed, the words barely audible in the stillness of the room. "He sold our son to maintain his new life." The truth hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her gasping. He sold Jordan like he was nothing more than a commodity, a thing to be traded. Marcus placed a steady hand on her shoulder, offering silent support, but Amara barely felt it. Her mind raced through memories. Jordan's infectious laugh, his favorite blue blanket worn thin from years of love, the way he always held his brother's hand when they crossed the street. Her son, her precious baby, traded away by his own father like merchandise. The rage built slowly at first, simmering beneath her skin, then crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her vision blurred as tears of fury filled her eyes, hot and stinging. The papers in her hands crumpled as her fingers clenched involuntarily, destroying the evidence of Derek's heartless betrayal. "He's going to pay," she said through gritted teeth, each word sharp with 7 years of pain and betrayal. The promise hung in the air like a weapon ready to strike. That evening's sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, making his tall figure even more imposing as he moved back and forth. His face, usually composed for public appearances and business meetings, twisted with barely contained rage, a vein pulsing at his temple. Jay sat rigid on the edge of the plush leather couch, his small hands gripping the cushions until his knuckles turned white. The boy's school uniform was still perfectly pressed from morning drop-off, but his shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself invisible in the growing darkness of the room. A bead of sweat trickled down his neck despite the cool air conditioning. "I saw you looking at her on the plane," Derek snarled, stopping directly in front of his son, his shadow completely engulfing the small boy. "That flight attendant. Did you recognize her? Don't think I didn't notice how your eyes followed her." Jay shook his head quickly, his eyes fixed on the floor, studying the intricate patterns in the wooden boards. "No, sir. I didn't talk to anyone. I was just looking out the window most of the time." Derek grabbed Jace's chin roughly, his manicured fingers digging into soft skin as he forced the boy to look up at him. "Don't lie to me. I heard whispers in the galley. Have you been talking to her? Planning something behind my back?" The boy's lower lip trembled as tears welled up in his eyes, catching the fading sunlight like tiny crystals. "No, Dad, I promise. I don't know what you're talking about. Please, believe me." Derek's fingers dug deeper into Jace's jaw, leaving red marks that would likely bruise by morning. "You know exactly what happens to people who betray me, don't you?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. "Your brother thought he could be clever too. Look where that got him. Remember that day, Jace?" Tears spilled down Jace's cheeks, running over Derek's fingers and dripping onto his perfectly ironed school shirt. "Please, Dad," he whimpered, his voice barely audible. "I haven't done anything wrong. I wouldn't ever—" "If you betray me," Derek hissed, leaning closer until Jace could smell the expensive cologne mixed with afternoon whiskey on his breath, "you'll end up like Jordan. And this time, there won't be anyone left to miss you." Jace's entire body shook with silent sobs, his face pale as fresh snow with terror. The threat hung in the air between them, heavy with 7 years of unspoken violence and fear, a weight as tangible as the darkening shadows stretching across the room. In Marcus's dimly lit office, maps and photographs covered every surface of his weathered oak desk. The private investigator leaned back in his chair, his experienced eyes scanning the surveillance photos of the Haven's perimeter, while Amara stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "These people are dangerous, Amara," Marcus said, his voice gravelly with concern. "The Haven isn't just some religious retreat. It's a front for something much darker. My sources indicate they're involved in human trafficking." Amara turned from the window, her face set with determination. "I don't care how dangerous they are. I won't lose them again." She moved to the desk, picking up a photo of the facility's rear entrance. "Jordan's in there somewhere. I can feel it." Marcus rubbed his temples, studying the building blueprints he'd managed to obtain. "Security is tight. They've got cameras here, here, and here." His finger traced the locations on the map. "Guards patrol every 4 hours, but there's a blind spot near the kitchen delivery entrance." "That's our way in," Amara said, her voice steady with determination. She pulled out Jace's burned letter from her purse, carefully unfolding it. "Jordan mentioned working in the kitchen in his letter to Jace. It has to be the same place." "I understand," Amara replied, her fingers tracing the edges of the burned letter. "But my boys need me. Jace is trapped with that monster, and Jordan—" Her voice caught slightly before she steadied it. "Jordan's been alone for so long." They spent the next hour planning their approach, marking entry points and escape routes. Marcus detailed the security patterns while Amara memorized the layout. Her flight attendant training helped her focus on the details, treating it like an emergency protocol she needed to master. Later that evening in her hotel room, Amara sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounding herself with everything they'd gathered. Photographs of the Haven's exterior, Jace's burned letters, Marcus's notes about guard rotations. She organized them meticulously, building her case. Her hands moved deliberately as she arranged the evidence in a manila envelope. Proof of Derek's deception, Jordan's location, the suspicious activities at the Haven. She'd made copies of everything, ensuring the authorities would have what they needed when the time came. Amara picked up the stack of burned letters, holding them close to her chest. The paper still carried the faint scent of smoke, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. "I'll bring them both home," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. The early morning darkness shrouded the police command center in shadows as officers moved with practiced efficiency, checking equipment and reviewing tactical plans. Amara stood near a concrete pillar, her flight attendant uniform making her stick out among the Kevlar vests and tactical gear. Her fingers nervously traced the edges of her small notebook, its pages filled with carefully documented evidence against both Derek and the Haven. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Marcus appeared at her side, his presence steady and reassuring. His weathered face showed the strain of countless sleepless nights spent building their case. "Everything's in place," he said quietly. "They've got teams positioned on all sides of the facility. We've covered every possible angle." Amara nodded, trying to still her trembling hands as she listened to the tactical commander's briefing. The officer's voice was clear and authoritative as he pointed to various positions on a large map spread across the hood of a police vehicle. The early morning breeze rustled the corners of the paper, forcing another officer to hold them down with gloved hands. "Primary entry teams will breach here and here," he explained, indicating the main entrance and the kitchen delivery door. "Secondary teams will cover all possible escape routes. Remember, we're dealing with potential trafficking victims. Proceed with caution. Any sudden movements could create panic." The words made Amara's stomach clench painfully. Somewhere in that building was Jordan, her son, who'd spent years trapped behind those walls. She clutched her notebook tighter, its pages containing every scrap of evidence she'd gathered. Financial records, witness statements, photographs, and the burned letters that had led them here. Each piece was a step closer to bringing her family back together. "Please let this work," she whispered, her breath visible in the cool morning air. The weight of her uniform badge pressed against her chest, a reminder of how far she'd come from that first flight, where she'd spotted Jace. That moment felt like a lifetime ago, yet the memory remained crystal clear. As dawn approached, the teams moved into position around the Haven, their movements precise and coordinated like a well-rehearsed dance. Amara and Marcus watched from their designated observation point, far enough away to be safe but close enough to monitor the situation. The facility sat quiet and dark, unaware of the forces gathering around it. Security lights cast eerie shadows across the building's facade. Suddenly, headlights cut through the dim morning light. Amara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the sleek black car pulling up to the scene. Derek's car. The vehicle's engine purred smoothly as it came to a stop, the sound carrying clearly through the still morning air. Her whole body tensed as she watched him step out, his movements casual and unhurried. He paused, scanning the area with the practiced wariness she remembered all too well. Even from this distance, she could see the familiar, arrogant set of his shoulders as he surveyed his domain. His expensive suit seemed to absorb the shadows around him. Rage bubbled up inside her, hot and fierce, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. After everything he'd done, the lies, the separation of their sons, the years of pain, here he was, still acting like he was untouchable, like the world belonged to him. "Not this time," Amara whispered through clenched teeth, her nails digging half-moons into her palms. She caught Marcus's eye and gave a subtle nod. He understood immediately, reaching for his radio to alert the tactical team of Derek's arrival. The static crackle of his transmission seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The scene was set. All the pieces were in place. As Amara watched Derek walk toward the Haven's entrance, she felt a grim satisfaction settle in her chest. His kingdom of lies was about to crumble, and this time, she would make sure he couldn't slip away. Justice was finally within reach. The sound of doors being breached echoed through the Haven as tactical teams swarmed the building, their boots thundering against the ground. Amara and Marcus followed behind a group of officers, their footsteps quick and purposeful on the polished floors. Emergency lights cast an eerie glow through the hallways, creating dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to mock their desperate search. "Jordan!" Amara called out, her voice trembling with urgency and maternal desperation. Each empty room they passed made her heart sink a little more, the weight of possibility crushing against her chest. The facility's pristine appearance felt like a mockery of the darkness it concealed, its clean walls hiding unspeakable secrets. Marcus moved methodically, checking corners and doorways with the precision of someone who'd done this countless times before. "Stay close," he warned, his experienced eyes scanning for any signs of danger or movement. They passed through what looked like a classroom, chairs scattered as if someone had left in a hurry, abandoned worksheets still lying on desks. Room after room revealed nothing but abandoned spaces, each one crushing Amara's hope a little more. Her desperation grew with each passing minute, her hands shaking as she helped check every possible hiding place. The sound of officers securing different areas of the building echoed through the corridors, their calls of "clear" becoming a haunting chorus. "Here!" Marcus called out, stopping at a heavy door with multiple locks that seemed excessive even for a secure facility. "This one's different." He stepped aside as an officer approached with tools to breach the door, the metal implements glinting in the emergency lighting. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as the locks gave way one by one, each click seeming to take an eternity. The door swung open with a metallic groan, revealing a small room with a single window, bars casting striped shadows across the floor. In the corner, curled up on a narrow bed, was a thin figure wrapped in a threadbare blanket. "Jordan?" Amara's voice was barely a whisper, hope and fear warring in her chest. The boy lifted his head, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief, darting between the officers and settling on her face. Though years had passed, Amara would know those eyes anywhere. They were the same as Jace's, the same as her own, though now shadowed with experiences no child should endure. Jordan looked so much smaller than she remembered, his frame fragile from years of neglect, his clothes hanging loose on his thin shoulders. Tears streamed down Amara's face as she rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the bed. She wrapped her arms around her son, feeling his body trembling against hers, his heart racing like a trapped bird. "I've got you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, years of searching culminating in this moment. Jordan's fingers clutched at her uniform as he began to cry, years of stored pain finally finding release in his mother's embrace, his tears soaking into the fabric as he held on like she might disappear if he let go. The wail of sirens filled the night as a child services vehicle pulled up to the Haven, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searching beacons. Jace sat in the back seat, his small hands fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. His heart fluttered like a trapped bird in his chest. The social worker, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Thompson, helped him out of the car, her gentle hand steady and reassuring on his shoulders. "Your mom's inside," she said gently, guiding him toward the building where officers and emergency personnel moved about with purpose, their shadows dancing across the dimly lit pavement. Jace's steps were hesitant at first, his worn sneakers barely making a sound on the concrete. But as they approached the entrance, something changed in his expression, a spark of recognition lighting up his tired face. Through the open doors, he caught sight of familiar figures in one of the rooms, his mother and someone else he hadn't seen in what felt like forever, someone whose face mirrored his own. "Jordan," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat like a desperate prayer. Breaking free from Mrs. Thompson's gentle grip, Jace ran forward, his feet carrying him faster than he'd ever moved before. He darted past surprised officers, his heart pounding with each step against the linoleum floor. As he reached the doorway, time seemed to slow down, stretching like taffy around him. Jordan looked up from their mother's embrace, his eyes widening in recognition. The twins stared at each other for a moment that felt eternal. 7 years of separation hanging between them like a fragile thread about to snap. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting soft shadows across their identical faces. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, they rushed toward each other. Their bodies collided in a desperate embrace, arms wrapping tight around one another. Tears flowed freely as they clung together, their shoulders shaking with sobs that carried years of longing and pain. The scent of hospital disinfectant faded away, replaced by the familiar comfort of family. "I thought I'd never see you again," Jordan choked out, his fingers gripping his brother's shirt so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I missed you so much," Jace responded through his tears, pressing his face into his twin's shoulder, breathing in the reality of his presence. They held each other as if trying to make up for all the lost years in a single moment, their breathing syncing naturally as it had when they were smaller. The bond between them, though stretched by time and distance, remained unbroken, as strong as steel beneath their tender embrace. Amara watched her boys reunite, her own tears falling freely down her cheeks. She moved toward them slowly, not wanting to break their moment, but drawn by an overwhelming need to hold them both. As she reached them, she wrapped her arms around her sons, pulling them close against her, feeling their warmth seep into her bones. "We're together now," she said, her voice filled with emotion, feeling their small bodies press against her as they included her in their embrace. Her hands trembled as she stroked their backs, memorizing the feeling of holding both her children again. The warmth of their reunion seemed to chase away the coldness of the facility around them, creating a bubble of love and safety that had been missing from their lives for far too long. In that moment, despite everything they'd been through, they were whole again. Amara stood in the doorway of their new suburban home, watching as Jace and Jordan explored the empty rooms with cautious excitement. Sunlight streamed through large windows, casting warm patches on the hardwood floors. The house wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, a fresh start away from the shadows of their past. "What do you think, boys?" she asked, her voice gentle and encouraging. The twins exchanged glances before Jace spoke up. "It's big," he said softly. Jordan nodded in agreement, staying close to his brother. Moving day was a quiet affair. Amara had deliberately kept things simple, knowing her sons needed time to adjust. They didn't have much furniture yet, just the essentials: beds, a small dining table, and some comfortable chairs. The rest would come gradually as they settled in. 3 times a week, they visited Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist specializing in trauma. The sessions were difficult at first. Jordan barely spoke, while Jace often burst into tears. But slowly, week by week, Dr. Chen helped them find their voices. "Remember," Dr. Chen would say, "healing takes time. There's no rush." Amara attended her own therapy sessions, learning how to support her children while processing her own grief and anger. Some days were harder than others, Sometimes she'd catch one of the boys flinching at sudden movements or hiding food in their rooms, habits born from years of fear. They developed new routines together. Every morning, Amara made breakfast while the boys set the table. They talked about simple things, what they wanted to learn in school, which colors to paint their rooms, the stray cat that visited their backyard. One evening, as they unpacked another box of belongings, Jordan found his old teddy bear, the one Amara had kept all these years, hoping to return it to him someday. His eyes welled up with tears as he hugged it close. "You kept him," he whispered. "I kept everything," Amara replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I never stopped believing I'd find you both." That night, after a simple dinner of mac and cheese, the boys' favorite, Amara led them upstairs to their rooms. Each boy had his own space now, though they often chose to stay together. Their rooms were gradually filling with personal touches, Jordan's drawings on the walls, Jace's collection of library books on the shelves. As they changed into their pajamas, Amara sat on the edge of Jace's bed, watching as Jordan climbed in beside his brother. Some habits would take time to change, and she understood their need to stay close. She pulled the soft blue comforter up to their chins, smoothing it gently. The nightlight cast a warm glow across their faces, faces that were finally beginning to look peaceful in sleep. Leaning down, she kissed each boy's forehead. "We're safe now," she whispered, her heart full of love and protection. "You're home." The familiar crunch of gravel under their feet brought back a flood of memories as Amara and her sons walked the winding path through Riverside Park. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground where, years ago, two toddlers had squealed with delight on the swings. Birds chirped softly in the trees above, providing a gentle soundtrack to their homecoming. Jordan paused near the old oak tree, its branches spreading wide over a weather-worn wooden bench. Its familiar scratches and markings were like old friends welcoming them back. "Remember when we used to have picnics here?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Jace's face lit up, his eyes sparkling with recognition. "Mom always packed those peanut butter and banana sandwiches." "Cut into triangles," Amara added, watching as her boys settled onto the bench. The past few weeks had brought subtle changes in them both. Their shoulders weren't as tense, their smiles came more easily, and there was a newfound lightness in their movements that made her heart soar. "I used to climb this tree," Jordan said, reaching out to touch the rough bark with gentle fingers. "Jace would stand below, worried I'd fall." "Because you always climb too high," Jace protested, but he was grinning, the afternoon sun highlighting the dimples in his cheeks. They wandered to the playground, where bright new equipment had replaced the old metal structures they once knew. The twins gravitated toward the swings, not to sit, but to stand nearby, sharing memories of competitions to see who could swing higher. The chains clinked softly in the breeze, a familiar sound that seemed to unlock even more memories. "Mom would count to 3, Jace recalled, drawing patterns in the sand with his shoe, "and we'd jump off together." "And land in the sand," Jordan added, laughing softly. "Remember that time I got it all in my shoes? It took forever to shake them out." Amara listened, her heart swelling with each shared memory. These stories were precious gifts, bridges between their fractured past and healing present. She watched as her sons moved from the swings to the slide, their voices growing more animated with each remembered adventure, their words tumbling over each other in their excitement to share. The afternoon light began to soften, painting the sky in gentle shades of orange and pink. Other families started heading home, strollers squeaking and children calling their goodbyes. But Amara and her boys lingered, savoring the peaceful moment. They found themselves back at the old oak tree. Jordan had grown quiet, his expression thoughtful as he watched the setting sun paint the clouds in brilliant colors. Without warning, he turned to Amara and wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her shoulder. She could feel him trembling slightly. "Thank you for finding me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, his fingers clutching the back of her jacket. Amara held him close, feeling the steady beat of his heart against hers, breathing in the familiar scent of her son. "I'd do it all again, for you," she murmured, meaning every word with all her being. In the soft glow of her home office, Amara sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The manuscript of her memoir lay beside her, its pages marked with sticky notes and editorial comments. She'd spent months pouring her heart into these words, documenting every step of her journey from loss to reunion. The screen displayed the final paragraph of her acknowledgments. "To my sons, Jason Jordan, whose strength and resilience taught me the true meaning of courage, and to every parent searching for their child, never lose hope." Lisa, who had become more than just a colleague after their shared experience, had read the early drafts. "Your story needs to be told," she'd insisted, tears in her eyes. "Think of all the people you could help." The local women's shelter had already requested copies for their resource library. Marcus, who'd helped her through the darkest days of the search, had connected her with support groups for families of missing children. The response to early excerpts had been overwhelming, messages of encouragement and shared experiences flooding her inbox. As Amara reviewed the final draft, certain passages stood out, bringing back waves of emotion. Fear can paralyze, but it can also motivate. Each morning I woke up knowing my children were out there, and that knowledge became my strength. The uniform I wore as a flight attendant became my armor, hiding the battle I fought beneath my professional smile. In the end, it wasn't just about finding my sons. It was about finding myself, the strength I never knew I had. With trembling fingers, Amara clicked send, submitting the final manuscript to her publisher. She sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly, feeling both drained and liberated. The setting sun cast warm rays through the window, illuminating the fresh paint on the walls, a soft blue that Jordan had chosen. From downstairs came the sound of laughter, Jason Jordan playing one of their video games. The familiar noise wrapped around her like a comfort blanket, grounding her in the present moment. Rising from her desk, Amara picked up a newly framed photograph. It captured a moment from last week's family picnic, all three of them smiling, their faces glowing with genuine happiness. The boys' therapy sessions were helping them process their trauma, and day by day, their smiles grew more natural, their laughter more frequent. Walking to the living room mantel, Amara carefully placed the photo in the center. It stood as a testament to their journey, not just of survival, but of healing and hope. The afternoon light caught the glass, making the image shine like a beacon of their fresh start. The mantel held other treasures too. Jordan's first art project since coming home, Jace's merit certificate from school, and small mementos of their new life together. But this photo, this moment of pure joy captured in time, represented everything they'd fought for and everything they'd become. Standing back, Amara studied the arrangement, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. The memoir was finished, their story told, but their journey together was just beginning. The kitchen buzzed with activity as Amara put the finishing touches on the birthday cake. 2 number 11 stood proudly on top, one for each of her boys. The vanilla frosting sparkled with blue and silver sprinkles, the twins' favorite colors. Lisa helped arrange 12 chairs around the dining table, each place setting decorated with festive paper plates and party hats. "I can't believe how much they've grown," she said, straightening a crooked napkin. In the living room, Jace and Jordan sat cross-legged on the floor with Marcus's son Tommy playing with their new remote control cars. Their laughter echoed through the house, a sound that still made Amara's heart skip with joy every time she heard it. "Can we have cake now, Mom?" Jordan called out, his eyes bright with excitement. The therapy sessions had helped him come out of his shell, and his smile grew more confident each day. "Soon, sweetie," Amara replied, adjusting the candles. "Let's wait for everyone to arrive." The doorbell rang and Jace jumped up to answer it. "I'll get it." He no longer flinched at unexpected sounds, though Amara noticed he still checked the peephole before opening the door. Some habits were harder to break. Their neighbors, the Hendersons, arrived with wrapped presents and warm hugs. More guests followed: the boys' art teacher, their therapist, Dr. Chen, and 2 friends from their new school. Each arrival brought more gifts, more smiles, more normalcy to their healing home. When it came time for cake, everyone gathered around the dining table. The boys sat side by side, their faces glowing in the candlelight. Amara watched as they held hands under the table, a gesture they'd started doing during difficult therapy sessions that had evolved into their own special way of supporting each other. "Make a wish," Marcus called out as everyone began singing, "Happy Birthday." The twins exchanged knowing looks before blowing out their candles together. Applause filled the room, and Amara caught Lisa's eye across the table. "We've come so far," she said to Lisa, who smiled in agreement. The community center buzzed with anticipation as people filled the rows of chairs, their hushed conversations echoing off the high ceiling. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the wooden stage where Amara stood, adjusting the microphone with practiced care. Her hands trembled slightly, but she drew strength from Jace and Jordan's presence beside her, their matching smiles giving her courage. Lisa sat in the front row, her familiar face beaming as she gave an encouraging thumbs up. Marcus was there too, arms crossed and nodding reassuringly, his steady presence a reminder of how far they'd come since those first desperate days. The boys wore matching blue button-down shirts that Amara had carefully ironed that morning, their curly hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. They looked so grown up, so different from the scared children they'd been just months ago. "Good afternoon, everyone," Amara began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My name is Amara Daniels, and these are my sons, Jace and Jordan." The twins stepped forward in perfect sync, shoulders straight and heads held high, looking more confident than she'd ever seen them. As Amara shared their story, her voice grew stronger with each word. She spoke about the night she thought she'd lost everything, the endless years of grief, and the miraculous moment she spotted Jace on her flight. The audience listened intently, hanging on every word, some wiping away tears as she described the painful journey to reunite her family. Several people nodded in understanding, while others reached for their neighbors' hands. "The hardest part wasn't finding them," she said, glancing at her boys with eyes full of love. "It was realizing that while I was mourning their loss, they were out there needing me. But we're here now, together, and that's what matters most. Every day is a gift we don't take for granted." Jordan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, his warm grip anchoring her to the present. Jay stood closer, his presence steady and sure, shoulder brushing against her arm. They were no longer the frightened children she'd found. They were growing stronger every day, healing together as a family. When Amara finished speaking, the room erupted in thunderous applause. People stood one by one until nearly everyone was on their feet, moved by her family's story of resilience and hope. But it was her son's proud smiles that touched her heart the deepest, making everything else fade away. Their eyes shone with love and admiration, finally free from the shadows of their past. As the applause continued to fill the room, Amara wrapped an arm around each of her boys, drawing them close to her sides. In their eyes, she saw not just survival, but true peace, the kind that comes from knowing you're safe, loved, and finally home. They were whole again, stronger for having been broken, and ready to face whatever came next together. Amara sat on a weathered wooden bench in their backyard, watching Jace and Jordan kick a soccer ball back and forth. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light, catching the highlights in their curly hair as they moved. Their laughter, pure and unrestrained, filled the air like music, a sound she'd yearned to hear during those long, dark years of separation. She marveled at how far they'd come in the past few months. The nightmares that used to wake them screaming had become less frequent, though she still kept their bedroom door cracked open at night, just in case. The fear that once shadowed their eyes had begun to fade, replaced by a sparkle of joy she thought she'd never see again. Their shoulders no longer hunched with invisible weight. Jordan made a spectacular save, diving dramatically onto the grass with his arms spread wide like a superhero. Jace doubled over with laughter, pointing at the grass stains now decorating his brother's shorts. Their playful banter carried across the yard, so different from the quiet, withdrawn boys they'd been when first reunited. "You look like you fell in green paint," Jace called out, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. Amara's throat tightened with emotion as she remembered those first difficult weeks. The way they'd flinched at sudden movements, how they'd hoarded food in their rooms, afraid it might be taken away. The countless therapy sessions where they'd slowly begun to open up, to trust again. Their therapist had warned her it would take time, but seeing their progress made every challenging moment worth it. Now, watching them play freely, without constantly looking over their shoulders, filled her heart with a fierce protectiveness. She'd failed them once, but never again. Every morning, when she packed their lunches with little notes tucked inside, every evening when she helped with homework at the kitchen table, every moment in between, she renewed her silent promise to keep them safe, to fill their lives with the love and security they deserved. The boys had started making friends at their new school, tentatively at first, but with growing confidence each day. Just yesterday, Jordan had asked if he could join the science club, his eyes lighting up as he described the robotics project they were planning. Meanwhile, Jace had brought home an art project he'd made, a colorful family portrait that now hung proudly on their refrigerator, complete with detailed drawings of their favorite toys and books. Small steps toward normalcy that felt like miracles. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Jordan attempted a fancy kick that sent the ball sailing over the fence into their neighbor's yard. Both boys turned to look at their mother, their faces flushed from playing, grins stretching ear to ear. They ran toward her, their feet thundering against the grass, each trying to outrace the other. Amara opened her arms wide as they crashed into her, their momentum nearly knocking her backward on the bench. She wrapped them both in a tight embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of grass and sunshine in their hair, feeling their hearts beating strong and steady against her chest. "We're a team now," she said, smiling as she held them close. "Forever and always." The aroma of homemade lasagna filled the kitchen as Amara placed the steaming dish on the dinner table. She'd followed her grandmother's recipe, layering the pasta with care and adding extra cheese just the way the boys liked it. The rich scent of garlic and herbs brought back memories of Sunday dinners from her own childhood. Jordan and Jay sat eagerly in their usual spots, their eyes wide at the sight of their favorite meal, feet swinging beneath their chairs, with anticipation. "Can I serve?" Jordan asked, already reaching for the spatula. His confidence in simple tasks like these had grown steadily over the past months, a far cry from the hesitant boy who'd first come home. "Sure, honey," Amara replied, settling into her chair and smoothing her napkin across her lap. "Just be careful, it's hot." Jordan carefully cut perfect squares, while Jace passed the plates around, making sure everyone had their share of the crispy edge pieces they all loved. The routine they'd developed felt natural now, comfortable in a way that still amazed Amara. The boys had stopped asking if they could eat, stopped checking to see if they had permission for seconds. These small victories made her heart swell with both joy and a touch of lingering sadness for the time they'd lost. "Remember when Mom tried to make this the first time?" Jace said, grinning as he scooped up a forkful of the steaming pasta. "It was so burned. The cheese was like charcoal." Amara laughed, shaking her head and pressing a hand to her chest in mock offense. "Hey now, I've improved a lot since then. Practice makes perfect." "Yeah, after burning it 3 more times," Jordan chimed in, his eyes twinkling with mischief, and they all dissolved into giggles. The conversation flowed easily between them as they ate, filling the kitchen with warmth that went beyond the heat of the oven. Jordan talked about his science project on renewable energy, his hands moving animatedly as he explained his ideas for a solar-powered model house. Jay shared stories from art class, where he'd started teaching other kids his drawing techniques, his quiet confidence growing with each passing day. The kitchen light cast a warm glow over their faces, highlighting their expressions of contentment. Amara noticed how they no longer ate as if the food might disappear, no longer hunched protectively over their plates like they had in those first difficult weeks. Instead, they took their time, savoring each bite between stories and laughter, shoulders relaxed and smiles genuine. When Jordan reached across the table to steal a piece of garlic bread from his brother's plate, Jace playfully swatted his hand away, nearly knocking over his glass of milk in the process. Their laughter echoed through the house, unreserved and genuine, bouncing off the walls like music. These moments, once taken for granted, now felt precious beyond measure. Amara watched her sons, their faces bright with joy, their voices carrying no trace of the fear that had haunted them for so long. Marinara sauce stained the corners of their mouths, and melted cheese stretched between their forks and plates. The simple act of sharing a meal together, something they'd missed for 7 long years, filled her with profound gratitude. As she gazed at her children, wiping away a happy tear before they could notice, a deep sense of peace settled over her. The weight of their past still existed, but it no longer overshadowed their present. This is just the beginning, she thought, ready to embrace their bright future together, one family dinner at a time. If you enjoyed the story of Amara Daniels, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.